Good morning from the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. And whether it's morning or afternoon or evening where you are, we just want to say thank you so much for joining us for Where We're Going. This series from ThinkND explores key topics and how the work happening at Notre Dame relates and impacts the United States and the world at large. I'm Dolly Duffy, the Executive Director of the Notre Dame Alumni Association. And this month, we are exploring privacy. And we've had the campus viewpoint hearing from our faculty, and last week we hosted the national viewpoint. Today, we will have a 3 contingent discussion as part of the global viewpoint, as our distinguished guests will be tuning in from Europe and Asia. We encourage each of you on this to get involved in our program, and please interact with our guests by asking our panelists questions. Thank you to those who've already asked questions in advance. We have incorporated them into the program, and throughout, please do use the Google form that we're sharing with you now to submit questions as they come to mind, and know that we're going to work really hard to incorporate as many of your questions as we can. And now I'd like to welcome our moderator for today's discussion, Mark McKenna. Mark is a 1997 graduate of Notre Dame and is currently the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law at the Notre Dame Law School and the director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center, which means that's a long title, and Mark has a lot of responsibility, so we're thrilled that he's taking time to join us today. Mark, earlier this fall, you had planned on hosting a privacy panel in Ireland as part of the Dublin football game celebration. I know you ended up doing the panel virtually, and I'm sure you were disappointed to not be in Ireland, but can you tell us a little about why you were planning on focusing on Ireland? And also tell me a little bit about what you missed the most about being over there.
Yeah, well, Rob and I were expected to be having some Guinness in one of the pubs. So Ireland has emerged as a really important venue for privacy and data protection. Some combination of the fact that there's a lot of global technology companies that have headquartered or put their European headquarters, at least in Ireland. And also the Data Protection Authority in Ireland, for reasons that have to do with some features of the privacy regulation system there, and because of the location of the companies, that Data Protection Authority has emerged as a pretty influential actor sort of within Europe and globally. And so we thought it would be a really great opportunity to kind of leverage some of the expertise that was there and some of Notre Dame's roots. And I think we were, we did wind up having a great program, but as you said, it was virtual, so not quite as fun as being in Dublin. But I think it was a really good conversation, and Rob, who's joining us here today, was able to actually be part of that. So, I will, in the interest of time, as we sort of move on, just to. I'm not going to detail our panelists' bios today. I've already mentioned a little bit, but you can find them on the ThinkND page, and they've been emailed to all of you as well. So I'll just quickly introduce the panelists. The first is Rob Corbet, who I was just alluding to, is a partner at Arthur Cox in Dublin. And the other is Jing, who's a graduate of the law school from the class of 2000, is now a founder of the Gen law firm, which is, I think, the second law firm that Jing has been a founder of in Beijing. So Rob and Jing, welcome to both of you. Thanks very much for being with us. As I think I mentioned to both of you in our conversations the last couple of weeks around privacy here, we're focused initially on the campus and on things nationally within the United States. But in that context, several people raised the sort of increasingly global dimensions of privacy. And so I thought maybe we could start there, and I would ask you some questions about that. And particularly maybe just starting with thinking about how different governments or different regulatory regimes around the world are approaching privacy, just conceptually. So I mean to focus here on like how do different countries conceive of what privacy is, what interests are at stake, what kind of trade-offs are involved. And I know that we've got some diversity around the world. So maybe Rob, you might want to start a little bit about sort of like how does the EU, the Irish government approach privacy, just from a starting point? Like what's privacy or data protection about?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's a good starting point, I guess. I mean, often in Ireland, we wonder aloud, are we nearer to Boston or Berlin? I'm talking to you today from Dublin. And privacy maybe is a good example of how we sometimes don't quite know exactly where we fit. And you mentioned the role of Ireland and the Data Protection Authority. So from an Irish perspective, I think a US audience would have a common understanding of the kind of framework we work in, a common law jurisdiction, English speaking. We have a constitution that recognizes the right to privacy. And you know, we've got a lot of US companies that are centered in Ireland as well. But we're also we're a valued member of the European Union since 1973. And with that has come a European influence, which has been very much where the privacy agenda has come from. And since 1981, there's been this bunch of privacy principles under the Strasbourg Convention and have some global application. The American equivalent might be the FIPS, the Fair Information Processing Principles. But they've evolved in Europe, and it's all been driven from Europe. So we had a directive in 1995 that established a kind of a common playing field for privacy laws in Europe. And it was felt that that was no longer fit for purpose, which is where the famous GDPR came along in 2018. And the idea there was to introduce a new singular statement of privacy law across the entirety of the European Union. From an Irish perspective, we got to grapple with that because we have to comply with the rules, obviously. The rules are automatically applicable here, but we notice as the rules are being applied in Europe that sometimes Irish government and Irish regulators might take a slightly different view to how privacy should be enforced or what's important in privacy to what you might hear on the mainland Europe. So it can lead to a certain amount of politicization actually of privacy, even within the European Union, where you'd expect there to be a common framework, because as I say, sometimes we just wonder whether we're nearer Boston than Berlin.
Yeah, great. Jing, maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of the Chinese approach to privacy and you know, what kinds of concerns you see companies facing there.
I probably will give like three major strokes about what's going on about the privacy in China. First of all, in China, when we talk about privacy, we actually use two terms. One is privacy, the other one is personal information. They're actually not really interchangeable. There's some subtle distinctions reflecting some very different philosophy here. In China, the government take a note of the need of protecting the privacy or personal information. But what's really going on is that the philosophy is that the government wants to encourage development of the internet firms or AI technology firms. So in a way that the government has a relatively loose standard for privacy or personal information. They don't really want all the protection of personal information or privacy impose quote unquote unreasonable constraints over internet firms. Government does not really say that, but that's really our interpretation, and also that's verified in reality. If you're looking at our current civil code, which was just enacted, this distinction about personal information and privacy, what really means that the law really allows that citizens
Looks like maybe Jing we lost for a second, so I think.
I think I'm back. Sorry.
Okay, you're back. That's okay. Keep going.
Maybe
everybody's gotten used to that, Jing.
Maybe some personal information privacy was blocked. Anyway, yeah. the point is that our government probably actually would make a distinction of personal information and privacy, which really means that personal information can be somehow transacted, okay, by individuals or organizations in a way to, as an asset, okay? Our Chinese love assets, anything tradable. But privacy is protected something, more fundamental to integrity of a human being, something spiritual. So we do have that distinction. Now, those things are probably given much higher value in the law. But stuff that we can trace you, whatever is you're doing on the internet, or even your facial recognition, some of stuff I think our government secretly or jurists, our legal thought leaders can think that can be traded. So that's actually probably more of bigger picture here.
That's great. So Rob, let me throw that back to you, because I think it echoes something we sometimes hear about distinctions between what happens in Europe and the United States and elsewhere, and the difference between the United States focus on privacy and the European focus on data protection, right? Which maybe has some echoes in the distinction that Jing just made. So do you think that that distinction is meaningful in terms of thinking about the ways that the regulation is approached in Europe as opposed to the United States?
I think it's one of the things that contributes to a lot of confusion, actually, because the European view of life is quite different to the one that Jing mentioned, in that data protection is given this fundamental human right status, as opposed to just the right to privacy, which many people would feel like Jing had mentioned is a more narrower, more spiritual thing that applies to you. So the idea that personal information should be tradable as an asset, as might be the case in China, is not one that prevails in Europe, because Europe has struggled to differentiate at all between the fundamental nature of data protection and the fundamental nature of privacy. And I think that leads to many of the issues that arise and many of the confusion that arises outside of Europe is based on that failure to understand that the European courts and European regulators are starting from a perspective that they're dealing with a fundamental human right, when they're dealing with whether it's IP addresses on the internet or tracing apps for COVID-19, or whether you opt in or opt out to a marketing database. They shroud them all under this idea of the protection of a fundamental human right, which for many people makes it feel all very confusing, because it starts to become difficult to say what aspects of data protection and privacy are actually really important, versus which, the regulation of data protection in its entirety. Should we really focus on ad tech, for example, the tech industry around advertising? Is that the really important thing? Many people might say, not really. Yet privacy, invasion of privacy by governments and invasion of privacy by covert operators or businesses, that may well be very important, but it's hard to distinguish it from a European perspective, because it's all under the same umbrella of a fundamental human right.
Yeah, so that's, if you just sort of keeping track of the threads, I think as we see sort of emerging across the world, there's sort of like some countries that are putting emphasis on privacy as the sort of primary, and others are the primary head there, and others on data protection. The other is, I think, sort of how we conceive of what the interests are really about, right? And so you talked about how Europe has sort of put its stake down on the idea that the data protection is a fundamental human right. Privacy in the United States is regulated primarily as a consumer protection matter, right? So we sort of think of it as sort of economic regulation, but meant to sort of protect consumers. And so Jing, I think, Gab, what you were talking about, this sort of distinction in China between personal information and privacy, it's like you've got a little bit of both of those things happening, but with some emphasis on, helping some of the companies navigate, and having these things not sort of interfere. Does that sound like that?
Right.
That tracks pretty well?
Yes, and what's really getting interesting is that we actually seen that's a really growing or stronger awareness of privacy protection among average Chinese people. They actually did some recent news getting on the headlines, actually widely circulated on social media, about the facial recognition. One of the law professors in Beijing had this headline news. She was fighting against what they call the local residential, like this neighborhood. The local, like a property company, right, require everybody to pass this facial recognition in order to get into the residential apartments. So she was fighting on that. She filed, I think she made a complaint, and then the journalist picked that up, and then it's becoming a big news. So it's really resonated lots of people's concern. People are starting to be uncomfortable these days about that they're like a facial identification are taken everywhere. Okay, we have lots of cameras, in an office building, residential building. It gives sort of like a convenience, but now people are really wondering what's really going on. And there are actually more and more news that the deep fakes technology are being abused by criminals. Okay, the fraudulent, the financial frauds, people taking withdraw money out of the ATM machine by using the deep fakes technology. So I think more and more people are getting uncomfortable. So there's really stronger awareness. It's more practical, okay, concern out of the safety, right? Probably less from this context of human rights. So that's just something that we think could be a driving force that somehow shape the way we're looking at privacy in China.
Face recognition, I think, is a hot, difficult problem everywhere. I think we're seeing a lot of that here. So one thing I wanted to pick up on is sort of, as we sort of, I think, starting to see in this is that, and this is a theme that came out of some of our previous conversations, especially with some of the leaders of these, the big multinational companies, is that we're seeing sort of, differences emerge in different parts of the world in terms of the way privacy and data protection work, which is ironic because it's sort of increasingly dealing with, global transfers of data and companies that are dealing with most of these in many of these different countries. So I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about your experience about how you help your clients navigate that mismatch, right? The sort of global nature of the internet and of the data flows, but the regional nature of the various regulations here.
Sure, maybe I'll go first. That's been fascinating, in particular in the last 5 or 7 years. I've been doing this for about 20 years, and the location of data was probably a thing back in the early 2000s, and people hosted their data locally and minded it carefully and so forth. Then they started outsourcing it to trusted third-party companies, and then along came the cloud, and it's all about data, and the exponential growth in data. So very, very quickly, the location of data became irrelevant to businesses, really. It was just the availability of somewhere to store it was the priority. And people felt that the horse had bolted, therefore, that the idea that privacy laws could be applied to data in a globalized environment was that, it was too late. But I think within Europe, there was a feeling from Europe that, no, it's not too late, that we can actually put the genie back in the bottle here. And one of the things they do in Europe by looking at the application of privacy laws is they look at the location of the data. They see it as a core issue, which for many of us feels funny because we're carrying around devices in our pockets, but the data is dispersed all over the universe and we never know where it is. And the idea that the location of the data is important seems alien to us. But the reason they do that in Europe is to avoid sort of forum shopping, so that the standard of data privacy that we discussed earlier can be applied in a meaningful way. They apply it for the benefit of all EU citizens, regardless of where their data is located. And that's led to some really interesting developments. So even though the European laws are supposed to only apply to Europe, they do have this extraterritorial effect. So the clients we advise, technology companies and others, have to grapple with the idea that they have a globalized customer network or user network around the world. They like to operate at scale, so they like to operate consistent standards. And yet the laws governing where the data can be held and the circumstances in which it can be transferred are regulated really quite tightly in the European Union. So there's been a couple of landmark decisions arising not from the breach of data protection per se, but by the very ability to move data from Europe to a country outside of Europe. And one of the things that US audiences often find amusing is when a European Union laws determine that the United States is not adequate. So believe it or not, the European Union has determined that the United States is inadequate when it comes to data protection. And as a result, it has put constraints around companies moving data from Europe to the United States. And the European courts have shown themselves only too eager to apply those rules quite rigidly to restrict or regulate in a very heavy way the transfers of data from Europe to the US or indeed around the world.
Yeah. Jing, I know that when you and I were talking earlier, you were talking about this both in terms of US or European companies that are doing business in China, but now increasingly Chinese companies doing business in these other locations. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the dynamics that you see your clients facing there?
Yeah, there are actually quite a few dimensions. From the multinational perspectives, early on, our advice is more on like a data storage, where the data should be stored, right? In China, can they transfer out to China with some flexible requirements? But gradually, it seems like a multinational, the company accept the reality. They store the data in China, especially after Apple took the lead. Nowadays, actually, the local firms, big internet local firms, they are actually getting more and more sophisticated. In the past couple of years, people just talking about, hey, everything's about consent. Let's just come up some kind of policy as long as a consent base, and then nobody really cared how the consent is given. Okay, they feel like it's like a gold standard. But now the Chinese firms realize that the global digital trade really requires them to be more sophisticated. Now, we've recently been helping some of our e-commerce clients and even hardware in a smart hardware company on the global privacy policy around the world in some major markets. We work with the foreign councils to come up the privacy policy. One of the interesting things is that GDPR is somehow like sort of the golden standard. That's the toughest one. So people like, no, okay, as long as we match that, and we should be safe. You actually might be surprised to hear that at least the clients we work with, they are actually willing to take on some of the toughest standards to be safe. They want to behave right outside China, make sure that digital trade can be done in the right way. So this is second stage. I think that the third stage we're actually looking at is in combination with the government initiative. China's been working on quite a few free trade agreements. Because we're not part of the TPP, which was a US-led, and we're not part of the CPTPP, which is a Japan-led, the American version of the free trade agreement. Now, China, obviously, our internet firm want to global. We want to actually have the digital trade going global, looking at what Ant's Financials doing, looking at how many of our internet firms trying to go to Southeast Asia, South America, maybe Middle East, or even Africa. I think Chinese government also leading the way to looking at what should be done under the digital trade policy, make sure our companies probably can do this with sort of make sure to comply with the local law. So in that context, I think the privacy policy, privacy concerns will probably be picked up by more of the local internet firms.
Yeah, that's great. So Rob, you might remember that when we talked back in August at our other event, we were hearing a lot of the big companies talking about the sort of the real desire they had to figure out kind of like what was the most reliable kind of thing that they could comply with that would get them compliance in the most parts of the world. And we hear a lot of, like Jing said, that GDPR is kind of where everybody kind of pegs their compliance. Although I think we've seen some moves in the United States lately in California to try to maybe become the new global standard. And then as Jing was talking about, I think, if you follow the history of how we did this with intellectual property, you might start seeing privacy put into trade agreements as ways. So I wonder, I'm just going to ask you to speculate a little bit, sort of, if you're looking 5 or 10 years out, do you see a prospect for greater international agreement about privacy, or do you see a future where one or more of these regional things just becomes kind of this default standard that everybody complies with?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to see it kind of aligning given how disparate the approaches are at the moment. I mean, I used to enjoy being in the United States, telling people about this GDPR thing that was coming down the track and being looked at like I had two heads, that this was a crazy law. It was never going to work. It certainly would never work in the United States. And now the same companies who were saying that to me are now the ones calling for a GDPR style federal privacy law in the United States. So I suppose you can never say never in terms of what might happen in the future. But a topic we might get onto is, which I think is the big barrier to alignment here, is the willingness of governments to cede control over their own access to data. And I think that the standards there are so far unaligned across the world that I think that's where the stumbling block is. I think you could look at, I think during the discussion we had in August, the Irish Commissioner Helen Dixon participated in that, and she referred to the idea of a Paris Accord type arrangement for data. Could we have like the Paris Climate Accord? Could we come up with some sort of international accord in relation to data privacy? And one could anticipate that that's possible if one is talking about the application of the GDPR principles. But when you come to then governments see their own ability to perhaps access and use the data of both citizens and non-citizens, I think that's where you start hitting stumbling blocks. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen. There's going to be a number of years of a lot of confusion. I think Woody Hartzog, who participated in the last panel, identified the chance of a federal privacy law at 0% or maybe 1%. So I think if we don't get something close to a US federal law that aligns somewhat with GDPR, we don't have sufficient commonality there to see it really coming together. Not that I can predict at the moment.
Yeah, it's funny because one of our alums last week who works on this for Microsoft, he was a little more optimistic, but I think maybe that's because that's his job is to lobby for some of that. So he was a little more optimistic about a federal privacy law. But so, Jing, I want to come back to that point about sort of government access, because I know that was a major issue in the sort of U.S. European relations on this too. But Jing, given what you were describing before about sort of increasing awareness among Chinese citizens, and then even increasingly among many of your Chinese company clients about sort of their compliance with global standards in Europe or elsewhere, do you see coming out of maybe out of Asia or out of Chinese relationships with some of these other places prospect for greater sort of uniformity?
I do think so, actually. Right now, if we're looking at it's yes or no, I should say. If we're looking at the current personal information law draft, if we compare that with the GDPR, you can see that lots of concepts were taken from GDPR. Lots of them, okay? But there's some fundamental differences here. It actually reflects some of the philosophies when it comes to the view of the government, the governance, everything. And from what I know, like in GDPR, you have the white list, like of countries, right? If the country is in the white list, then the company can basically have a much more freedom. Now, in China, the way we regulate it, to us, in the mind of the Chinese government, we have this concept called the critical information infrastructure, okay, CIIO. If you are a critical information infrastructure operator, it can be a very large telecom carrier, or it could be an internet firm taking lots of user data. The government is really going to be watching you. You're gonna pass a lot of regulatory approvals. That reflects our government's probably philosophy. We want to watching on this the ones that are with the critical information. This is probably something that at least the Chinese government is not willing to let it go. Okay, this is kind of part maybe hard to be uniform. I think that there's always comes down to something much deeper. On the commercial side, I actually predict there may be a tighter or more strict, even maybe GDPR 2.0 version against the bigger firms. If we're looking at today's trade world, I think the big firms are on the retrieving side. All the national governments are operating under the consumer protection or the income equality, all this right philosophy, right? Going after global firms. I think global firms will be watched heavily, especially someone from China, right? Global firm based in China, looking at what the TikTok is encountering. That's getting more complicated. The populism is going to play a big role. It's going to probably driving tougher standard against the private global firms. On the other hand, when it comes to public safety issues, looking at what happened after COVID-19, I think after all this crisis, I think the citizens around the world will probably be willing to give away lots of their privacy. They're going to let it go. They're going to allow the governments to track them down. This is what's happening, at least in China. Every one of us using this green code to show we are coming from the low risk area, so we can travel around China. That works, right, in a way. But we do know that we're giving away lots of our personal information to the government. I think it's gonna be polarized in terms of the trend.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess that's a good place to go next, because so Rob, I was gonna ask you about sort of the access for government, because I find that it comes as quite a surprise actually to my students when we start studying things like the relationship between the U.S. and Europe, and you study the Schrems decisions, and it turns out that the sticking point there about, you know, the adequacy of US protection is about the US government's ability to access this information through NSA wiretapping or through some of these, some other means like that. Because most of the students, my students tend to think of the bad actors in the privacy space as the big platform companies, right? They don't really have government on their mind so much. So it's interesting that, you know, both of you have sort of highlighted the potential access of the government as the sort of sticking point, or one sticking point at least, about the sort of globalization there. So I wonder if you could just say a little more about that, about sort of like, is that are the differences between European government's access to private citizens' data and what's happening in the US, are those really big differences, or are these not such big differences, but they're sort of being made that way for, you know, yeah, go ahead.
It's a really interesting point, because, you know, despite the fact that the upstream and the prison programs that are operated by the NSA in the United States have been viewed by the European courts as constituting mass and indiscriminate surveillance, the truth is that most of the data that we make available, or that is made available online, is of very little interest to any government anywhere. Okay, so the interesting point, when you look at the likes of the Schrems judgments and the implications for our clients in terms of having to respond to that, they're suddenly having to ask themselves questions like, is the data I hold, or is the data that I store with my supplier over there, is that subject to US governmental surveillance? And you'd be surprised at how many clients go, I don't think so, but they don't know for sure, because some of the surveillance by definition is covert and so forth. So it's just interesting that in the European court cases, they've picked apart US surveillance laws as being, if you like, the Trojan horse to unpick the adequacy of the United States data protection laws. Whereas if they applied the same microscope to European Union member states' governmental access to data, they'd find many of the same problems. And I think this is going to come into sharp focus in the next 6 weeks, because on the 1st of January, the United Kingdom is going to complete its transition out of the European Union. And on the 1st of January, the UK will no longer be an EU member state. So therefore, it will be required to be treated the same way as the United States. So therefore, assessing the United Kingdom's adequacy, one would have to look at the United Kingdom's own governmental surveillance programs, which themselves are very extensive, but which to date have been impregnable from an EU perspective, because they were under the cloak of European data protection and fundamental rights laws. When that stops to be the case, ceases to be the case on the 1st of January, will the European Union take the same jaundiced view of the United Kingdom that they have taken in respect of the United States? And it's not yet clear what's going to happen there. So we're watching it quite closely. But to flip to the other side of your point, the thing that occupies people in a much more day-to-day basis are the big internet companies, and the ceding of control of their data to the chosen number of internet companies that have effectively managed to outperform all others and become very, very powerful in terms of the use of data. However, while people say they care about that, the famous privacy paradox is that people say they care about their privacy, but they don't act in a manner that's consistent with what they say. So in reality, people tick boxes, concede, give consents, store endless amounts of personal data online, and they give it to multinational companies to use it for commercialization purposes. So when people say they really care about their privacy, they don't always act like they mean it.
Yeah, Jing, you alluded to that earlier about the sort of consent thing. That's a hot topic for criticism in the United States, is that because we've got this consumer protection model, that everything seems to be just like, well, as long as there's consent, you can do it. One of the people watching sent in a question about that, about how that maybe be creating some more cynicism about privacy statements and about consent, that people just sort of, they don't really trust that the companies aren't going to do whatever they want anyway. So the reason people just click those boxes is that they think they're just performance art or something, right? They don't actually constrain. So Jing, is that what you were alluding to earlier?
Yeah, I think so. This is really formalistic, right? All this consent policy, and it's really not an informed decision. I think right now there's something like everybody just sort of live with it. I guess, I hope it's not going to happen, but I'm guessing no major change going to happen until something like a big disaster, big crisis happens, something like a massive leakage of data comes out, happened, and then there's a real loss, right? We heard about all this leakage, but so far, at least, I have not seen like a real, we have not seen, at least in China, the reports of like the huge financial loss, etc. It feels like, oh, okay, some database was accessed, millions and millions of data came out. Then people say, seems, I have not lost my money yet. But I think one day, maybe when those thieves are getting really becoming very harmful, then everybody gonna get really serious.
Yeah, we have. Go ahead, Rob. I'm sorry.
So I'll tell you a quick anecdote if we have time. That a company in the United Kingdom did a survey where it offered users of the London Underground free Wi-Fi if they positively gave the consent to give up the lives of their firstborn child, in return for which they'd be given free Wi-Fi. I think it was 86% of people ticked the box.
Yeah. There's a pretty famous researcher in the United States who did a lot of work on this, and I think I won't get the numbers quite right here, but I'll be in the ballpark. That it would take you something like 3.5 weeks if you worked 40 hours a day constantly just to read the privacy policies of more of the companies that you mostly deal with. And of course nobody does that. And even when I teach privacy, like I'm a lawyer, I don't read them, right? Because I just sort of like maybe have the same cynicism. It doesn't really matter. They're gonna do what they want. So one of the other questions that came in was something I sort of wanted to talk a little bit about too, which is I think at least you, Jing, alluded to, maybe Rob a little bit too, which is the extent to which what the world's been experiencing with COVID has either changed people's views about privacy or might nudge us in sort of one direction or another. And so, Jing, you were talking about the sort of, using the apps to be able to travel around. So we don't have anything quite that widespread in the US, but every day I go to work, I have to fill out a little health check form that gives me a green pass that allows me to go to campus. I think those are sort of proliferating. Do you think that what people have been experiencing now is shifting attitudes about privacy or about privacy regulation in a way that will be noticeable to us in the next however many years? Jing, you want to start?
I think the people are probably more tolerant of being collected with their information, at least under the public, maybe for public health or safety reasons. What'll be interesting to watch is what will be the limit. And I recently come to this instance. In China for a while, I think probably back in May or June, we still sort of more on the tough side. We normally actually always, when we go to the restaurant, they actually take our name, our info, and a phone number. I always just write down a fake phone number. I don't never give my real phone number. But in one restaurant, do you know what they do? They actually call that number just to verify it's a real one. And I was so annoyed. Okay. So there's a limit. There's a limit. Right now we play the games, even during the COVID-19, but there will be probably a limit. I don't know whether that really means anything.
I think it's interesting. I think COVID shone a light on privacy in a particular way. I mean, when the crisis really started to impact in February, many governments were reaching to technology to help them, provide some level of solution at a time when there didn't seem to be many options. In Ireland, they started with a domestic program of seeing a local technology company, could they build a contact tracing app in March. By May, they decided they were going to partner with Apple and Google. So two of the very big technology companies came together with government to look at building a contact tracing app in partnership with the Irish government. The Department of Health, the governmental department, and the health agency, the health service executive, partnered with Google and Apple to build a contact tracing app, but they did so in consultation with the Data Protection Commission. So that through the months of May, June, July, when people were screaming, we need a contact tracing app, there was criticism about why is it taking so long? Why is it taking so long? That 2 months turned out to be 2 months well well spent, because in the intervening period, many other countries who had reached for a shotgun solution were finding a backlash from their citizens saying, this thing hasn't been properly thought through, it's draining my battery, the government are watching my movements, I'll have no privacy, people will know who I'm spending my time with, and so forth. But by the time the Irish application was launched, it had been through a very rigorous process with the regulator. All the documentation is publicly available, including a 63-page data protection impact assessment. And as a result of that, within 36 hours of the app being made available, over 1 million people had downloaded it. And now 2 million people, Irish people, have that app on their iPhones, which is about half the population, have the contact tracing app in their pockets. And I think that speaks to, something interesting, that in matters that people deem to be important, they do require a high degree of trust. So things like personal health and contact tracing, I think unless people trust it, like Jing doesn't trust the restaurant to not abuse his data, so he gives a fake number. As a result, the contact tracing efforts can't possibly be successful. So that in order for people to have the trust in relation to governmental access to their contact tracing, they wanted kind of a third party, like a data protection regulator, to stand over it and say, yes, this is built to the very highest standards. And as a result, consumers were prepared to embrace it. I think that's been different across the world. Different apps have been deployed at different speeds using different models. But that's how an app can be launched in a GDPR jurisdiction. It takes a bit longer, and it doesn't always get you the immediacy you want, but the solution sometimes, is worth the wait.
Can I add something here? Actually, when it comes to the trust part in China, it's, I think our default position is that people actually, I think, give the trust to the government. I mean, in China this day, in our high-speed train, we actually we can just tap our personal ID, and then we can get in the train station, without the ticket. Of course, we also pass the facial recognition. That's we really use all the personal information, all the automatic to pass through. In China, that right now the local governments, we talk about government, actually in China's local governments, actually based on provincial level, right? Our province, like normally the size of the states in Europe, lots of them have like maybe 50 million or 100 million people in that one province. And local governments took lots of data. But I think the default position of our Chinese people, I say, they give the trust to the governments. Lots of people just don't really ask a question when they take the data. They think it's okay. So I think probably reflects the differences of the philosophy of the culture.
Yeah, I think that those cultural differences are really interesting to sort of map onto the regulatory thing on this trust question. So Apple and Google, they were offering the development of that app, I think, to most governments in the world. I think there was some traction in Canada, but it really didn't go anywhere in the United States. But my impression, though, is that the concerns about it in the United States weren't about like the government collecting the data. It was about Apple and Google collecting the data and what they would do to it. So it's a sort of interesting reflection, I think, of like who are the entities that people are worried about abusing the trust, right? And I think in the US, a lot of it was really concerned about the corporate misuse of the data and what they would wind up doing with it, even. And so that's hard to figure out. That's a little, I think, harder to figure out like what the solution to that trust problem is. But I think it does reflect, what people think about the ecosystem of the use of data in the US.
Mark, I wonder would it have been different in the US if Apple and Google had been able to go to some division of government like the FTC or something like that and really get the thing objectively assessed within a regulatory framework. Because I think without the regulatory framework in Europe, it wouldn't have happened in Ireland either.
Yeah, so of course, like we don't have that in the United States. And so, yeah, there was no one to go to. Although you might have seen that California just this month passed a reformed privacy law that is going to create something like a data protection authority for the first time. And so there's not that'll be the first one of those in the United States. And of course, it's at the state level, but it's a big state. And so you could either see that as something that will get replicated in lots of other states, or maybe that will become a model for a federal version of it. I think the federal version is complicated politically, but you're right. There was no sort of centralized entity that they could go to help them sort of work through those trust things and, put a sticker on it and say like, you should rely on this. So we don't have too much longer, but I wanted to ask each of you, this is a pretty wide ranging conversation. So I'm going to ask you something very unfair that you can kind of take in whatever direction you like, but it's, just to sort of think about, you've both worked in this space for a long time and you've seen sort of the evolution of it. And so I want to ask you kind of, what do you see that's hopeful in the future and what worries you most, right? Or you could answer that in the form of like, what's the thing you would most want us to pay attention to? I see you both racing to answer that. Go ahead, Rob, you go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Let's get the concerns out of the way first, because then you can finish on a more optimistic note. I think the concern I'd have is a little bit what we talked about earlier about this fragmentation and a sense then amongst a whole generation or perhaps two generations coming through that this stuff just doesn't make sense. It's just a load of bureaucracy. It's just ticking of boxes. Your data's lost anyway. There isn't any real protection around that. And my concern is that there's a fragmentation of laws and approach across the world that doesn't dispel that sense of loss that consumers might have, particularly younger consumers. And I feel that could get worse if regulators don't focus on what's really important and get some real wins in relation to the establishment and defense of human rights and rights to privacy in terms of things that are important, not running down more check boxes, longer privacy policies, cookie notices, all that type of thing, but maybe getting some wins that are really important for people, and maybe COVID shone a little bit of a light on that. So my concern is the fragmentation is coming at a time when perhaps the younger generation particularly need the protection of the law. And I think by the time the protection of the law arrives, it may be, there's a danger that much of it will be too late for that generation. If I was on the hopeful side, I think the data economy is maturing. I think the all-you-can-eat model of data is probably had its day, so I don't think in 10 years' time, if we're having this discussion and looking back, we look back at the way that data was commoditized in 2020 and say, my goodness, that was a Wild West, wasn't it? Where everybody's personal data in their devices, inferred data that was directly shared, data that was obtained from third parties, was just monetized on this monumental scale that was not understood by any of the consumers at the time. And I think that day has had its time. I think, it was interesting 2020 and the US election, looking from afar, it wasn't an election that was framed around access to social media channels and the corruption of messaging through social media channels in the way that was a feature. I felt in 2016, again, speaking as an outsider. And I wonder, is that a reflection of the fact that perhaps the all-you-can-eat model is coming towards an end? I wonder if I've frozen. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we could hear you fine, Rob. You did. Go ahead.
For me, actually, the concern is probably on the cybersecurity side. We say privacy and cybersecurity, right? It's like the two hands of, the two sides of the hands. As I said, right now we give lots of trust to the government. We also give lots of trust to those big internet firms like Alibaba or Tencent. That's why these days that we go out even without our credit card, without a wallet, we just use our phone, right, to do all the business. We pay all those bills in the restaurants or buying the things from the street stand everywhere. We don't really carry our pockets. But as I said, that really like a local government protect those data. So the concern is, what if someday really some massive scheme, right, of a criminal acts was found out by the taking advantage of this data. This is something I think that at least I hope it's never going to happen, but it is my biggest concern. What's hopeful? I think we are, at least my generation, right? We've been, I was in South Bend from 1997. By now, 20 years, more than 20 years later, when I look at the way the way of life have transformed in China, we are somehow really lucky, right? Benefiting from all this digital economy. That's really amazing, the kind of a convenience, or looking at the kind of amount of the transaction we've been seeing. It's just tremendous. I'm just hoping that our internet firms can somehow keep transforming the views, like maybe business ethics. I think that's something, hey, Mark, you can do something good to the world. We actually apply the business ethics to all this global the e-commerce, and then taking on more of a Chinese firm, taking on the leadership, right, doing things ethically, and then and reapply the technology and ethics, and then and also bring this technology to benefiting lots of more countries, the poor people, and in other countries. That's I'm hoping that our country can do, that maybe can be in conjunction with some of the a big initiative the government's doing.
Yeah, that's great. So on the hopeful side, I think you can pick up and tie a thread together here, which is, so Rob, I agree with you. I think there's a here, and probably globally, there's a rising awareness about some of the things people are concerned about. So I mentioned earlier that the face recognition is a sort of hot concern here, but there've been a lot of movements, mostly locally here, to actually ban the use of facial recognition technology, at least by certain actors, at least by police or something. IBM, who's been a partner for us, actually kind of shifted their position on this after having previously, been sort of, in the middle about, wanting to make sure that, there was a room for technological development, but putting some constraints, came out pretty strongly on the side of limiting that technology altogether. And I think we've seen only very partial, but sort of some retreats by Facebook and Twitter in the face of lots of criticism about the way they were using data, some more awareness, and then Jing, to your point, I think there's on the technology ethics side, I think there's an increasing awareness among some of the big global firms that they want to be trusted, and they want to, so, I think there's room for, the well-intentioned actors here to kind of come together and, create some transparency and create some kind of agreement about what's necessary. But another thing that was hopeful, I thought our conversation last week with several, as I mentioned, several folks involved in the big companies is, really welcoming government regulation to set some baselines so that they're not kind of stepping out there alone without others. And so I do think there's some reason for hope, but I think it's also a massively more complicated problem than people realize. I think this was a good insight to that. So thanks very much to both of you guys for joining us. I know, Jing, you're up late. Rob, I hope it's time for you to go to the pub pretty soon here. Even without the virtual pub. Yeah, we could have. Anyway, thanks very much for joining us. This was the end of our three-part series, but ThinkND's got another one of these coming soon, so you can check on the ThinkND site. And thanks very much to our partners at the ThinkND team and the Alumni Association, and to you guys for joining. Thanks. Hopefully we'll see you guys soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.